Today we're finally going to get into our last method of solving quadratics, which is the quadratic formula. As we saw on the previous section where we get some crazy looking problems, sometimes we don't want to use completing the square and we cannot use factoring. So we're going to get into the third method, which is a quadratic formula. So just to recap, let's say I had to factor this quadratic. Again, what should I try? Always try factoring first. In this case, there is nothing that will multiply to negative 20 and combine to negative 7. Which means it cannot be factored. So if you try your x factor, there's no solution for it. So we go ahead and say can't factor, which means we move on to our second method, which is complete the square. In this case, if we go ahead and try to complete the square, we have to take 7, which is the middle number, and divide it by 2. In this case, we end up getting a fraction, and again, if you get fractions, sometimes it takes too long to solve, and it makes it difficult, especially if you're not 100% comfortable with fractions. So we want to be able to get around all of that. So this is where our third method comes in, which is a quadratic formula. So we don't have to worry about any of those things getting in our way. So again, is there another way? Yes, definitely. There is another way, quadratic formula. So remember, 3 methods, factoring, again, doesn't always work, even though it is the fastest way. Again, we went over completing the square, but again, sometimes you may end up with those fractions, which make it difficult sometimes to solve the equation. So third method we're going to get into today is quadratic formula. Again, this is going to kind of solve all our problems. Only thing is you have to memorize this formula. And this formula is not so bad. It looks a little scary at first, but again, not so bad once you get used to it. So again, the quadratic formula is an equation that always works to find the solutions to a quadratic equation. I would say this would be the preferred method after factoring. Here it is again. It's a big numerator, which you have to simplify, and then you just divide by 2 times a. So let's go ahead and get into the reasons why we want to use a quadratic formula. Again, it gives you the solutions when factoring doesn't work, and one more time, it avoids the sticky fractions when completing the square. All right, so let's get into our first problem. So again, I kind of have this graphic organizer for you guys where we can't do it piece by piece because sometimes just plugging everything into the formula gets a little hectic. So again, you don't have to do it piece by piece. You can plug straight into the formula, but it's kind of your choice. This kind of helps organize it and makes you write a lot less too. So again, we're going to start with our first equation. I'm actually going to zoom out of this and go into your handout. All right, here we go. So we're going to start with x equals 3x plus 1 equal to 0. It's already in standard form, so I just go ahead and start solving. First thing on the left column, I'm just going to have you guys identify your a value, your b value, and your c value. So in this case, a is the term next to the x squared. So we're going to have a equal to 1. It's an invisible 1 right there. B equal to 3. And c equal to 1. That part should be fairly easy. The next piece is we're going to focus on only a piece of the quadratic formula, which is this piece right here. And if we simplify that separately, it just kind of simplifies everything when it comes to coming into the entire formula all at once. So let's go ahead and just do that square root piece. We actually call that the discriminant. All right, let's go ahead and plug some stuff in. So I'm going to have the square root of b squared. B is 3. So I'm going to put 3 squared. I'm not using parentheses because it's not negative. Minus 4, although it's a good habit to have. And 1 times 1. So I just went ahead and plugged in the a, b, and c in their corresponding parts. Now I'm going to simplify this. I have 3 squared is 9. 4 times 1 is 4. Times 1 again is still 4. I subtract and I get the square root of 5. And I ask myself, can I break this down into 2 square roots to simplify? And the answer is no, because the only perfect square below 5 is 4, which doesn't go into 5. So I'm pretty much done simplifying the biggest part of the quadratic formula. Now I'm going to go ahead and plug it all back into the equation. So I'm going to go ahead and put x equals, which again, it's already solved for me. It's an x equals form. It says negative b, which is this piece right here. So I'm going to look at my b again. It's positive 3. So I'm going to put it as negative of the number 3. I'm going to use parentheses just to get in the habit of it. Plus or minus. That square root piece, again, I figured this whole thing out over here. So that's going to be just a square root of 5. So it just simplifies it for me from the start. And this is all over the number 2 times a. And I have 2 times, my a value is a 1. So 2 times 1. And again, you can probably skip steps at a certain point. But at first, just try to be very careful not to mess up your negatives and positives and multiplication. So I'm going to go ahead and simplify this. This is going to be x. And negative times a 3 is just negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 5 drops all over 2. And this is my final answer, and I'm done. I can't simplify this any further. This is kind of your best case scenario where you can't really simplify that much. Let's go ahead and move on to number 2. Go ahead and identify A, B, and C before I do. Alright, so if you have them written out now, you should have A equal to 2, B equal to -8, and C equal to -8 as well. So we're going to start off with the discriminant, which is a b squared minus 4ac. My b is -8. Definitely use parentheses. Minus 4 times 2 times -8. Alright, so again, make sure you have everything plugged in the right spot. B squared minus 4ac. -8 squared is going to be a 64 positive. Squaring always makes things positive. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 8 is 64. And negative times a negative is a positive. Now one thing you can do is you can actually type all of this into the calculator without the square root, and you should get the same answer and save yourself a little time if you think it's going to take you less time. But sometimes it might take a little longer. Alright, if we add 64 and 64, we get 128. And I always ask myself, can I break this down? Your answer in this case is yes. Now realize that 128 came from two 64s, which were both perfect squares. So I'm going to break this down as 64 times 2. It came from two 64s. And that becomes a radical 2. Alright, so I took care of the hardest part of the quadratic formula, which is the square root part. Now I'm going to go take everything I just did and plug it back into the formula. So x equals the negative of b, and b in this case is -8. So we have that double negative. That's why you should spend the time to write it out. We have our plus minus. We have 8 radical 2 from the square root piece. I'm going to plug that in. And I'm going to now divide by 2 times a. My a is 2, so it's 2 times 2. Again, if you feel like just going straight to the 4, that's fine. The -8 simplifies to a +8. Plus minus, bring down the square root. The denominator is now a 4. Now, in the previous problem we stopped here, but in this case I can actually keep going because I can divide both the first term, which is the 8, and the second term, which is the 8 radical 2. Both of these are divisible by 4, because 4 goes into 8 2 times. So I'm going to simplify that. 2 plus or minus. 4 goes into the 8 outside the square root, not the 2 inside. We always divide and simplify by the numbers outside the radical. And we get 2 radical 2. And we are done simplifying this problem out as much as possible. Unless you want to change it into decimals using your calculator, which is not needed. Alright, go ahead and identify A, B, and C for number 3. And come back and check what you have after. Alright, so you should already have A equals to 2, B equals to 4, and C equals to -1. We're going to go ahead and plug it into the discriminant, which is a square root piece. We're going to have 4 squared minus 4 times A times C, which is a 2 and a 1. Just plug in the substitution, that's all it is. 4 squared gives us 16, minus 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 1 is still 8. We subtract these, we get the square root of 8. Now, I asked myself, can I simplify this? And the answer should be yes. You can break this down into a perfect square 4 times 2, which simplifies to 2 radical 2. Alright, so now that I've simplified the square root, I'm going to go back and plug everything into my quadratic formula. So x equals, here's my big bar, the negative of b, b being 4, plus or minus, plug in my square root that I've already simplified, and divide all of it by 2 times a, which is a 2 as well. Now I'm just going to simplify it and finish it off. The negative of 4 is still -4. Bring down my square root, all over 4. In this case, I need to ask myself, what divides into all 3 of these numbers? So we're dividing by 4, and it divides on the left side nicely, but it doesn't divide on the right side evenly. So I'm just going to be reducing this fraction by 2. So I'm going to be taking everything and dividing it by 2. But only the numbers on that are highlighted. I am not going to divide the square root by 2. So again, it's only the whole numbers outside because that square root of 2 is not really a 2. It's a decimal value. So I'm going to get negative 2 plus or minus 1 radical 2. Now, if you don't want to put that 1, you can omit it. And you really won't see it in multiple choice answers. And then the bottom divides and gives us 2. Here is my final answer here to this quadratic. All right, I want you guys to go ahead and try out the other 3 problems, the one at the bottom of this page and the 2 on the next page. So go ahead and pause this video and go ahead and come back to it when you're done with all 3. All right, now that you've had a chance to solve these 3 problems, let's go ahead and check your work. So on the very bottom one on the first page of the notes, you should have gotten the final answer of x equals to negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 33 all over big giant fraction bar over 4. So this one doesn't really simplify. I'm going to go ahead and give all the answers and then I'll come back and do the actual work for them in case you didn't get the answers. All right, next one, you should have gotten x equals to negative 1 plus or minus square root of 6. And the very last one, you should have gotten x equals to negative 9, or negative 5. All right, so these are the answers. I'll go back and go over that, go over the actual work if you got it wrong. Otherwise, just go ahead and start your practice. If you're done with your practice, get it checked off and start your performance task problems. All right, let's go back to number 4. So again, when you figured out your ABCs, you should have gotten 2, 1, negative 4. B squared should have been 1 squared minus 4 times 2 times 4. That got you 1. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 4 is 32. But the 4 is negative. I forgot the negative there, which makes it a positive. That gives you the square root of 33 from the final answer, which means we can't simplify this. And when we plug it back into the formula, the negative of b would be negative times 1, the square root of 33, all over 2 times 2 for the 2a, which gives us the final answer that I wrote earlier. Negative 1 plus or minus radical 33 all over 4. All right, that's for number 4 on the bottom of the page. Let's go ahead and look at the answers and the steps for the next 2 problems. Again, ABC would be A is 1, B is 2, C is negative 5. Discriminant, you should have gotten 2 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 5. This gives us 4 minus 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times 5 is 20. Negative times a negative is a positive. So if you got the square root of 24 and didn't simplify, that's probably where you may have made a mistake. So that's going to be 4 times 6, which is 2 radical 6. So that's where the radical 6 in the final answer comes in. Let's plug it into the quadratic formula. The negative of b is 2. And the square root is 2 radical 6. And the denominator is 2 times 1 for a. You simplify this, you get negative 2 plus or minus 2 radical 6 stays the same, all over 2. And then all of them are divisible by 2, so I can divide them. Again, do not divide the 6. The 6 does not divide because it's not a 6, it's a square root of 6. So you get negative 1 plus or minus radical 6. And that's the final answer for that one. And the last one, identify your ABC. So we get the square root of A is 1, B is 14, and C is 45. We get b squared, so it's 14 squared minus 4 times 1 times 45. So in order to finish this problem, we're actually running out of time on this video, so I'm just going to put it on the next video. So just watch the next one if you didn't get this one right.